you very much. A very good afternoon to all the participants in the conference. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts. As was very rightly preambled, there is enormous opportunity for credit growth in India. In that context, I would like to play a role for which I would like to use this metaphor from the Indian epic Ramayana. In the Ramayana, when Rama's army, reaches the bottommost point in India and is staring at the Indian Ocean, Hanuman is sitting there, much like everybody else, wondering what to do. And at that time, he's not aware of his powers. Jambavan, the wise bear, goes and reminds him of his powers. And there's a story behind that as well, why, some of the because of some of the mischief that Hanuman did, Hanuman lost his powers and lost the awareness of his powers. It was Jambavan that reminded Hanuman of his powers. So in my very, very small way, I would like to play a role that is similar to Jambavan, to remind the Indian banking sector that it actually has the potentiality, the opportunity of a Hanuman, the way a Hanuman, helped Ram and was possibly the most important instrument in that epic conquest. In a similar way, both in furthering economic growth and in enhancing inclusiveness, the Indian banking sector, fintech, now allied with the banking sector, can play a significant role. The reason I'm going to focus on the banking sector, is first, it's banks that actually create money in the economy. If you think about the broad money, there's a book that I'm writing, which should be out, where we clearly make the case that it is banks that create money. When a loan is given, that's when a deposit is created, and deposits are part of money creation. If you look at broad money, deposits account for about 85% of overall money. And this is the case not only in India, but across the world. Banking sector is extremely important. Bank loans are really important. And, as was mentioned in the preamble, I think we should be looking at, at credit and credit from banks, not just as a privilege, but as possibly a right. Now, with that preambling thought, let me show some of the data why I think that the Indian banking sector has been like the Hanuman, that has not been aware of its of the potentiality that it has to actually contribute significantly. So I'm going to start by, so this is a chart where what I'm going to show you now is, a bunch of data, in the form of charts. This is a comparison of two countries that got independence on the same date, 15th of August, 1947, both India and South Korea. And this chart shows over a 6-decade period, 60-year period, the private credit to GDP ratio for South Korea and India. Quite interestingly, notice that in 1960, South Korea was actually lower than us in the credit penetration. Both the countries were, of course, at very low levels, but quite interestingly, South Korea was actually lower. Now, if you look at in 6 decades and you draw a trend line, the trend line for South Korea looks like a 40-degree line, while the trend line for India looks like maybe a 10-degree line, and that shows how the credit penetration has increased significantly more, far more, compared to India. This is the first comparison. Lest we basically get the impression that I've cherry picked any particular country, let me show you others. And next, let me show you another country in our neighborhood, India versus Malaysia. Here again, over a 60-year period, 6 decades, look at both countries being almost identical in terms of their credit penetration in 1960, and today, if you look at at about 150%, Malaysia is almost 3 times the level of, or 2.5 times the level of India. India at about 58% of GDP. Now, these are 2 countries. I'm going to show you, give you further evidence. But if you look at the of other countries as well, but why does this matter? This matters because if you compare, and I'm going to give you more robust evidence controlling for other factors that might have impacted. So in this chart here, what you see is the same difference in private credit to GDP on the left panel, and you see GDP per capita on the right panel. And again, notice that the GDP per capita in 1960 and the private credit to GDP ratio were almost identical for India and Malaysia. So this is, as close and apples to apples comparison that you can make. Look at the path that you see for private credit to GDP and the GDP per capita as well. Today, at almost around $12,000, the GDP per capita for Malaysia is actually multiples, many times, almost 6 times that of India. You look at the same thing for South Korea. Again, you see, up until even the 1970s, India's and South Korea's GDP per capita were almost identical. I've already shown you how they were actually lower than us, in terms of the credit penetration. There is a large literature in financial economics arguing why bank credit matters so much for economic growth, and this is just symptomatic of that phenomenon. Look at again how India versus South Korea, the credit penetration itself increasing exponentially in South Korea, and that also contributing to significantly, among other factors, and I'll come to controlling for other factors in the GDP per capita. Today, if you look at the GDP per capita of South Korea actually is again multiple order of magnitude higher than that of India. Lest you believe that this is again just 2 countries, let's look at India versus Australia. Here again, if you see up until even sort of the mid 1980s, India and Australia, their sort of credit paths were very similar. You see a similar, not that much of a difference in GDP per capita either. But then after that, from the mid 1980s onwards, the credit penetration takes off in Australia, and that is also reflected in significant differences in the GDP per capita. One more country, again, look at India versus Canada. Some differences in the 1960s, but still, if you look at the path hence, India's credit has grown at much lower levels compared to Canada, and that is also reflected in the GDP per capita. Now, lest you think that I have not controlled for other factors, here is actually this is a very careful empirical analysis. What economists actually call a panel data regression, where what you see in blue here is country fixed effects. That's basically jargon for to control for all observed and unobserved, let me say unobserved differences like culture, etc. So controlling for all observed and unobserved differences across countries, something that is essential whenever one has to make a comparison across countries, because the usual concern is that countries are different in many dimensions. So that is being controlled for here, accounted for here through a panel data regression technique called fixed effects. And then not only that, even the differences in export policy, which is basically our trade policy, exports to GDP, imports to GDP, differences in investment policy through gross fixed capital formation to GDP, all those are being controlled over a 60-year period. Pairwise comparison between India versus Malaysia, India versus South Korea, India versus Australia, and India versus Canada. And in each of these instances, what you actually see is that the significant increase in credit in each of these four countries compared to India contributed significantly more to their, to increase in their credit, in their GDP per capita, controlling for other important policies at the macroeconomic level. So bottom line, actually, in the first set of these slides that I've shown you, is that if you do a very careful pairwise apples to apples comparison between India and other countries, which were similar in their credit penetration in 1960, and look at it over a 6-decade period, you see that, your first takeaway, credit penetration increased significantly more in the 6 decades in these countries compared to India. And that had material implications for GDP per capita itself. So in some sense, this basically tells us, what India lost out in the 6-decade period because of inadequate credit penetration, because of bank credit not expanding enough. So that's the first takeaway, from this analysis. So in some sense, let me to sort of anchor the ideas here. I'm going to give you one more example, and this example I'm going to give you from cricket. If you, those of you who have followed cricket over some time, there was this team that was led by Mohammad Azharuddin in the 1990s. That team was famous for winning in India. We were basically tigers at home, but once we stepped outside the shores of, the Indian shores, or maybe a Bangladesh or a Sri Lanka, we were pathetic. We used to lose 5-0, 4-0 in Australia, England, South Africa, etc. I think if you look at the Indian banking sector, start doing cross-country comparisons in a similar way, in the way we basically should compare in cricket as well. The Indian banking sector resembles the cricket team of Mohammad Azharuddin. We seem to pat ourselves up on the back a lot, saying, "Oh, we are tigers at home." But the simple fact is, when you start doing comparisons with other peer economies, countries that were very similar to us 6 decades back, we are actually and we start looking like lambs abroad, Mohammad Azharuddin's team. So that's the first thought that I want to leave you. So the opportunity that there is actually is to transform the Indian banking sector from Mohammad Azharuddin's, cricket team, which, used to frustrate a lot of us as cricket fans, and transform it into a Mahendra Singh Dhoni's cricket team or a Sourav Ganguly's cricket team. That's what the opportunity lies in terms of credit penetration. Takeaway number one from my talk. But to just embellish this further, I'm going to give you evidence for not just, so I've shown you for 4 countries where I did a very careful comparison, not only in a pairwise, just basically statistics, just graphically, but also in a regression framework, controlling for all confounding factors and showing the importance of credit for rise in GDP per capita. If you look at India versus the rest of the world as well here, you see again a similar phenomenon, how India has been such a huge laggard compared to the rest of the world in terms of credit penetration. I think those 2 lines, actually, the picture speaks, as they say, a picture speaks 1,000 words, and this picture speaks those 1,000 words. In a similar way, if you compare India versus the OECD economies as well, again, the pattern remains the same. In fact, one other point I would mention: India today at about 58% of credit penetration, 58% private credit to GDP, is where the rest of the world was 6 decades back. Let me just allow that to sink in, how much of a laggard we are on credit. India today at 58% of private credit to GDP is almost at the levels that the rest of the world was 6 decades back. If there is one statistic that actually can capture how how far we are behind the world in terms of credit penetration, I think this would be the statistic to actually, to sort of drive that point home. As I just showed you, same thing for, for OECD as well. So, you can keep doing this comparison with peer countries till the cows come home. But the point actually that India has a huge laggard, in credit penetration compared to the rest of the world, I think is just a very, very robust point that actually cannot escape, and any number of excuses, any number of reasons will not escape that conclusion. So the opportunity, therefore, is to basically try and catch up with the rest of the world, and I already have shown how important that is for rise in GDP per capita. Now let me come to, so that was the overall pie itself in terms of the, the fact that because credit penetration has not happened, we've been such a huge laggard that has impacted our GDP per capita, the growth in that. But let's look at inclusiveness, and, let's look at, some ways of cutting the data to see how we've done in terms of equity of credit, as well, credit penetration. Here again, another picture that speaks 1,000 words. Look at the urban per capita credit versus rural per capita credit. I don't know about you, but when I look at this chart, I just feel incredibly frustrated when I look at a chart like this with all that I've shown you so far in terms of the credit penetration. Now, people may say this is because of lack of branches in the rural areas. That is not true, as I'm going to show you in this chart here. If you look at the bank branches per lakh population for rural and urban, it's actually almost similar. The orders of magnitude difference that you see in terms of rural, versus urban credit penetration is certainly not because of the lack of bank branches, nor is it because the public sector branches, which actually public sector, as we know, public sector banks account for almost 75 to 80% of credit. It's not as if the gulf in the number of public sector branches per lakh population is quite different either. So it is not because of the of branches. It is just simply the fact that despite branches being there, despite things like priority sector lending, etc. Look at the appalling, differences in the urban per capita credit versus rural per capita credit. Other ways to see the same thing. Look at basically a region that actually where the credit penetration is worse than in sub-Saharan Africa, Northeast. Compare Northeastern region with the rest of the country. Again, you see how not only did the Northeast start at much lower levels, yet the slope has been so poor. And if you expand and see Eastern region versus the rest of the country, a similar story as well. And neither of these two patterns, Northeast versus the rest of India or East versus the rest of India, is because of the of bank branches. And by the way, some of you might be wondering, is this a demand effect or is it a supply effect? When you look at in a six decade period, demand is endogenous. What does that mean? This is a word that we academics use, endogenous, which means that is demand is an effect. If credit is given and credit is given well, then per capita GDP increases, and increase in per capita GDP then basically increases demand as well. So these phenomena that I'm pointing out over long periods of time cannot basically suffer from the excuse that, oh, this is because demand is not there. It is a supply side phenomenon. The fact that we basically have just not done enough on giving credit or have done enough in enhancing the equity of credit penetration. I think that's very clear from it's not because of bank branches itself. It's just the per capita credit actually seems to be so much lower. And other ways, actually take a look at this particular chart here. It's not just about retail credit, but even look at credit to small firms versus large firms, and in any economy, creative destruction, something that Schumpeter talked about in the 1940s, that creative destruction is actually one of the most important barometers to measure the vibrancy of an economy. creative destruction happens when small firms grow to become big and challenge the big firms. Or it could be small startups, or actually it could be smaller other firms. But look at the credit that is going into the smaller firms here. Look at over almost a 13-year period. If anything, the proportion of credit that is given to micro and small industries has declined, not increased, over the last 13 years. And that also tells you a story of actually how, whatever in the unicorns and the, startups that we are seeing is despite the lack of credit, is not because of credit. So again, the banking sector, the financial sector has basically not contributed its bit, in enabling creative destruction in India. For a few more facts as well. Look at the, and these are all drawn from the economic survey to 2019-20. If you look at the number of banks in the global top 100, India actually has one, and that too a 58th ranked, State Bank of India in this using 2019 data. Even countries that are a fraction of our size, like Singapore, Switzerland, have more banks than us. I think if there's again, this is the kind of chart when I look at actually having done research on the Indian banking sector for the last 2 decades. These are the kind of facts that make me really frustrated, and and think about what could have been if the credit market basically had just kept pace, even half the pace of our peers, let alone keeping the same pace. So basically, we have, India should have had 6 banks in the global top 100, while it has only 1, and it should have 8 by 2025. That tells you again the dwarfism of the banking sector, the Indian banking sector, compared to the size of its economy. So this, this is the across different angles how the banking sector has punched way below its weight compared to the size of the Indian economy. Look at it same way. Actually, people may say, "Oh, is this because of the size of the economy measured in GDP?" No. Look at the number of banks. Actually, plot the number of banks in the global top 100 against GDP, in US dollar billion. And that straight line, that line of fit is basically where India should have been. And yet India is so behind, so far down, which basically tells you how much of a laggard we are in terms of, and look at China actually, which is far more of a leader in this case. If you look at, even when the Japanese economy grew, in the 80s when it was growing, of the top 25 banks, something like 15, 16, if I remember right, where the top banks were Japanese. And that is basically, again, tells you how important, the size of the banking sector, the size of the credit balance sheet itself, the banking sector is so important for the growth in the economy. And this is not, by the way, because of differences in GDP per capita either. If you do the same thing with basically private credit, penetration with respect to GDP per capita, India again is a huge laggard. If you do that with population, again laggard. I think across so many ways of looking at the data, I think the fact a huge laggard compared to peers is just is a unanimous conclusion that comes across, and that is where the opportunity is. The opportunity, therefore, given how much time we've lost, 6 decades that we've lost, is not for basically 10% growth or 20. We have to basically, if we've been so far behind in 6 decades, the Indian banking sector in the overall credit has to run much faster, much faster in order to actually catch up with the rest of and that is where the opportunity really is for those who are actually listening in here, for the credit economy to really pick up. And why is that? So now actually I've shown you all these so many different ways in which the Indian banking sector has been lagging. It's primarily because the use of data, analytics, technology, etc. has been so far behind. Even private sector banks, which have actually, some of them have used data analytics only on retail lending. There is not a single bank yet yet in India which actually has cracked the code of how to go give credit to, to corporates actually using data analytics technology, creating the organizational, structure. There is an opportunity, and yet in contrast, what do our banks do? Basically, while the SLR requirements are some 23-25%, they go and put 40% in the G-Secs. That think about actually that 17-18% could potentially be lent as well. Obviously, there is risk there, but business is all about taking risk, and the business of banking itself is about taking credit risk, and therefore the CEOs, the boards basically need to should have brainstormed, at least now need to brainstorm, what is the model, what is the infrastructure in terms of data, analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the people, the organizations, the HR, how to basically create that so that we actually are able to lend to the, to credit-worthy firms, small firms, but credit-worthy firms. Another key aspect, that is important. India, if you look at the economy, 60% of our GDP comes from the service sector, and service sector does not have collateral. Is an asset-light business, and yet almost 90 or more than 90% of lending that happens in India is all asset-based, collateral-based. So where is the service sector actually? How is it going to get credit if models models for lending based on cash flows as collateral, if those are not evolved? The amount of opportunity there is to actually for data analytics to give corporate credit, not just retail. And this is where I dock the private banks as well, that they've not figured out models for giving, using data analytics, etc., to go and, to give to corporates. A phenomenon that has been there is that, while we basically have dubious promoters who continue to, to basically take credit and default on it, we have large sections of the society who actually are credit rationed. And these are some evidence again, actually, about how the poor quality of financial the poor quality of financial information among the large defaulters. Here, this shows how the accounting score itself is actually much lower for the willful defaulters compared to the median for the firm. That tells you actually that one of the areas that banks need to invest in is in financial information itself. This is not rocket science. Let me tell you, this is not rocket science. All it requires is somebody who actually appreciates the role of technology, the role of data, and the advances that have happened in this area over the last decade or so, to put his or her head down. We got together with a couple of other, people at the board level to figure this out. This is not rocket science. It also requires actually people to be not suspicious of technology, to understand the importance of technology. And therefore, far more, engineer MBAs or engineers and data scientists actually need to come into the banking sector. If you look at the data, if you look at the far more chartered accountants in the Indian banking sector, we need far more techies coming into the banking sector so that data analytics, etc., can be utilized significantly. Another, same piece of evidence, how if you look at the related party transactions that are done by willful defaulters, or if you look at the, the share pledging, all that is actually, much higher than the willful defaulter. This is all data that can actually be coded, can be analyzed to not only figure out the ability to repay, but also the willingness to repay. These are the two key things that any credit decision actually looks at: willingness to repay and ability to repay. Willingness to repay, now there's a lot of research that can be used to actually assess that as well. And both of these measures, I think, for corporate loans need to be figured out. Similarly, overall, if you look at the information asymmetry, if you look at in September 2014, both public sector and private sector banks were actually proportion of lenders that were already tagged as NPA by other banks. Only 1/4 of those were being tagged by banks. So in other words, let's say there's a borrower that is tagged as an NPA by bank X. Bank Y did not tag it as an NPA. Only 1/4 of Bank Y. The other banks actually were tagging it. I think this is a no-brainer that should have been happening, but it has basically, of course, that has increased now, in the last several years. But this is the kind of, just low-hanging fruits of data that has not been utilized by the Indian banking sector. Overall, in the Indian banking sector, including the private sector banks, has been very light on data, analytics, technology, technology, and that is what we actually see as that is a primary reason why we see actually such lagging behind peers on credit and showing up in terms of inclusiveness as well. So going forward, this is one of the ideas that we had advocated in the economic survey, a public sector banking network. It is essentially a way of utilizing data. There is so much third-party data as well. Public sector banks can and should go and analyze the data that is there now with the Jan Dhan accounts. More than 400 million accounts, and over a year, so many transactions. At least once or twice in a month, money comes in through direct benefit transfers. These people are using those accounts for paying their maybe mobile prepaid mobile, or so many transactions. More than 6-7 years of data. That's a gold mine for actually giving data. Giving for assessing the ability to repay and the willingness to repay. If we just do that, which is take the 400 million accounts and look at ones where credit can be given, I think that itself will increase inclusiveness. And yet I would love to know more about, is there any public sector bank that is going and really putting its head on how to analyze this 400 data on 400 million accounts to go and lend to the bottom of the pyramid through the Jan Dhan account. This is where fintech needs to go. Fintech is not about basically going and giving more credit to people like me or people like other people who are possibly here in the participant. It's about going and giving credit to those that have hitherto not been getting credit. That's where the real opportunity lies. So to summarize, a passionate prayer to the Indian banking sector, to be first, as like Jambavan, to remind them of that they have the power of Hanuman, none other than Hanuman, to actually go and make a huge difference to both GDP per capita and to inclusiveness, inequality as well, both economic growth and inequity. Because India's credit market, use any data, cut it any which way you want, lags far behind global peers, and that's where the opportunity really is. Credit to key to economic growth and reducing inequality. I would suggest 3 measures that must be tracked at the macro level in India, which is how much lending to hitherto unbanked, how much lending for creative destruction in the real economy. This is where the real increase in GDP per capita and inequity will happen, and how much lending to dubious promoters. The third one, of course, should basically be something that should be reduced, while the first 2 should be ones that should be increased. I'll stop there. Thank you.